I'm excited to welcome my colleague Jaslina Sani to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you so much, Wendy, and thank you, Chancellor May, Dr. Tan, and Dr. Brashear for your opening comments this morning. I am honored to be introducing this year's keynote speaker, Dr. Chaco. Dr. Chaco. Ernestine Chaco is a Navajo from Standing Rock, New Mexico. She is near the water people, born for the Meadow People. She dedicates her success and perseverance to her mother, Theresa Tsosie. She is incredibly proud of her heritage. She is currently an emergency medicine resident physician at Indiana University School of Medicine. She holds a medical degree from UC Davis School of Medicine and a law degree from the University of New Mexico School of Law with a focus on Indian law. She has a strong interest in developing scholarship in the area of impacts of federal, Indian, and tribal law on Native American health. And with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Chaco.
Hello, I'm wondering how I can share my screen from my presentation.
Dr. Chaco, do you see a green share screen button at the bottom?
Oh, yes, I do. There you go. Thank you for that. Right, do you see that now?
Yes, we do.
Perfect. All right, Yate she Ernestine Chaco yin she tuahan nishla halsoi bashchi nakai deneta she kayani dashanella. Those are my clans, and that's the way we introduce ourselves to our community. It really is important because relations for my community is significant. So if any of my relatives are out there, hello. I know some people were excited to hear me talk today about these issues, and I'm super thankful for the CHEq group for giving me this space to speak about these Indigenous ways of being, because often our spot is often left out. You know, when we talk about studies, when we talk about things, usually it's like Black, Hispanic, and then you don't really hear about Native Americans. And so I think I'm just really incredibly honored and proud today to be part of this conference. And so, like I said, being Diné in the time of COVID, you know, and I feel like for me, this really highlighted a lot of the things that I had been thinking about in terms of how this affects our health and our communities. And so I had given this presentation at a different, like a classroom, and it was surprising at the response I got. And part of it's because we don't learn about these kinds of things in our educational systems. You know, we learn about like Thanksgiving, you know, we learn about the Pilgrims, we learn about the Indians, but we don't really learn beyond that. And there's a lot more going on in the scene and what it means to be Indigenous today. So hopefully what I want you guys to get from this is an understanding of some of the history, some of the policy, some of the structures that sort of dedicate to being Native American today. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do today. And it's a lot of information, but like I said, I'm gonna do as much as I can. And I'm really grateful. Like I said, I'm on my ICU rotation right now. So I just got out of the ICU and I'm missing a chest tube for this, but I think it's a very important topic to talk about. So let's go. I don't have any disclosures. So like Dr. Tan had talked about, there's this shift that we need to make in our brains. And I think this is kind of the talk that I'm trying to push. So what I'm trying to do is shifting our focus of Black, Hispanic, and Native American as that identity as factors of social health determinants to racism and racial inequality as factors of social health determinants. And I know that's really hard to chew on. And believe me, this took me a lot of time to think through. And what I mean by this is, you know, when we introduce patients, sometimes we say, this is Mr. blah, 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 African-American, who's 36 years old, you know, as using that as a factor, as opposed to like, maybe there's something else going below more than that surface level of just a race. And so that's what I'm hopefully that you'll be able to see after this talk, that being Native American doesn't just mean like, oh, there's like a higher increased incidence of having diabetes, but there's a lot of layers going on that lead to that kind of outcome. There's a lot of layers. And so hopefully I can help you help unpack that. So like I said, there's gonna be a lot to talk about. So first I'm gonna talk about the Navajo Nation. So where is it? What is it like? And that kind of context to kind of give you an idea of what community I'm talking about, my community. Then we're going to delve into federal Indian policy. So very quickly, we're going to kind of talk about the different policies that happened throughout since the beginning of quote unquote when America was quote unquote discovered, and since then kind of talking about those policies. Then I'm going to talk about federal Indian law, which is the Marshall Trilogy, which are sort of the paramount 3 cases that shaped the relationships between tribes and the federal government. Then I'm going to talk about how those 2 things affect land development and how they infect all these different things, and why COVID became a very serious issue for my community. So it's not simply because we were poor or simply because we didn't have electricity or running water. There's a lot more going on beneath the surface than what the media was showing. And so hopefully today you'll get an idea and an understanding of the barriers that we have to face and the amount of resilience that we have to just to get through, just to get to where we're at today. So before we begin, definitions are very important. So Native American, I want to talk a little bit about this, like what does it mean to be Native American? There are 574 federally recognized Indian nations. There's various terms for it. It could be called tribes, nations, bands, pueblos, community, villages. Of these 574 federally recognized tribes, 220 of these are diverse nations are actually located in Alaska. So Alaska has a very diverse group of Indian nations up there. And then the other federally recognized tribes are located in 35 other states. So one unique thing about being Native American, so we're not only considered a minority group, we actually have a political relationship. And this political relationship was actually developed out of case law, court case law. So what does that mean? It means that Native American people and the governments that we have inherent rights and a political relationship with the government so that we have more than just race or ethnicity. And this was all created by a Supreme Court case that decided that this political relationship was why we can have certain powers and things like that, certain things that we can do in our community that other communities can't do. And so that's an important concept to remember. Also, tribal members are citizens of 3 sovereigns. So we're citizens of our tribe, we're citizens of the United States, and citizens of the state that we reside in. So we call this treble citizenship. And that's something that a lot of people are like, oh, do you pay taxes? Or those kind of questions come out of that. And there's a lot of complexity to that because we belong to these 3 different sort of separate entities. So moving on to what is a Navajo Nation. So as you can see here, the Navajo Nation expands Colorado, Utah. Majority of it is in Arizona and New Mexico. The size is, we're as big as West Virginia. That's kind of the land base. So if you think of how big West Virginia state size, we're about similar to that. Actually a little bit bigger than West Virginia. In terms of population, we have about 160,000 Navajos that live on the reservation. About the other 50% live off the reservation in different states. So we have about over 300,000 people that are part of our tribe. So Navajo Nation and COVID, like I said before, I was talking about back in April and May, our tribe had been hit very hard by COVID. And I think a lot of you have seen the news. It was like on ABC, there was all these different segments and clips about how we had the highest per capita infection rate after New York and New Jersey at one point, and it was very scary. People were getting very sick. There are even data that I saw that in New Mexico, half of the deaths are from Native American communities. So it was very devastating to our part of our community. And so that's the reason why I thought about this. I'm like, why was it like this? And so that's, hopefully we can sort of delve into that. All right, so this is a big concept, federal Indian policy in a nutshell. So what I'm going to talk about, so before we talk about what federal Indian policy is in terms of the timeline, what I'm saying by federal laws, I'm talking about congressional acts and executive orders. And executive orders are the ones that are created by the presidential office. So those are kind of considered federal laws. Then there's regulations, which are done by the admin law, which is basically under the presidential cabinet, like the Bureau of Indian Affairs and those kinds of things. Court decisions and policies, all these things really regulate closely Indian activities and lives. And so I'll talk more about what that means. And surprisingly, there is no other ethnic or cultural group that's so heavily regulated. And that's because, like I was talking about, that political relationship. This is part of that reason why. It's because we are so controlled by these different these different things. They limit our ability to do things. They give us, grant us power. So there's a lot of like power struggles in these different things. And so the body of law that's developed over the years is known as federal Indian law. So those are kind of some definitions. So the way my professor and the people that I've learned from about federal Indian policy, they talk about federal Indian policy as a pendulum. So they're, you know, people think of it linear, like you know, start time 0 to time, whatever, time 100, you go straight through. But no, but for federal Indian law, the policies, they keep changing. So for example, on one side would be tribal sovereignty and independence. The other side would be annihilation or assimilation. Through periods of time, this pendulum swings from one to the other, depending on who's president, depending on who's in Congress, depending on what period you live in. All of those really affect the policies that were shaped, that dictated what Native Americans can and can't do. So here's a kind of a busy slide, but I just wanted to show you what I'm looking at. So this arrow here shows time. So here would be like where quote unquote America was discovered. And then here is like today, okay? So the pendulum, like I said, one side here is annihilation or assimilation. Then the other side is tribal sovereignty / independence. So for example, one of my favorite professors talked about how in 1492 to 1828, we had actually a lot of tribal independence. Like we had a lot of treaties that were created with with the United States government because they recognized us as a nation. So a lot of independence was given to us. And then from 1828 to 1887, this is when this annihilation assimilation began, where we had these Indian removal acts created by President Andrew Jackson and reservation policy. So basically, a lot of the tribes in the Midwest were shifted towards the East Coast, for example, Cherokee, the Trail of Tears. So this is that kind of period where there was trying to be an annihilation of tribes by moving them out of their own communities. And another devastating policy that happened was from 1887 to 1934. 1934, this is the assimilation and allotment area. So this is what we talk a lot about. I don't know if many people heard of this, the boarding school era that happened during this time, really affected our communities. A lot of children were taken from homes and put in boarding schools and forced to speak English, forced to be away from their own communities. And that caused a lot of devastation to our own communities. And then even more too, on top of that, Allotment Act. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but this Allotment Act actually led to 3/4 of land being taken from Native Americans. So this was very devastating also to our communities. Then from 1934 to 1948, so IRA, which is basically the Indian Reorganization Act, was introduced here, where the Congress was like, oh, well, I think we're taking too much power from Native people, so let's give some back. So then they gave us the ability to create our own constitution, create our own governments and things like that. So some tribes decided to do this, and so they reorganized their own government to be recognized by the federal government. And then, like I said, the pendulum swung again, depending on the whoever was president during that time from 1945 to 1961. So termination started happening. So what that means is that they started saying like, well, because you're sovereign, you have the ability to take care of yourselves, therefore we're going to terminate our relationship with you. And so some tribes lost their status because of that. And then the pendulum swung again to more sovereignty independence in 1961 to present. Actually, President Nixon is the one who started talking about this Indian Self-Determination Act and sort of giving power back to tribes. And so this is where 638 contracting came from. So basically what that means is like tribes have the power to control Indian Health Service funding so that they can build the hospitals or funding the way they need to. So that's where that came from. So as you can see here, like I said, the pendulum swings back and forth, and who knows what's going to happen in the future. You know, even right now under the current administration, he tried to take some land away from the Mashpee or the Massachusetts tribe who was trying to get their land back. So, you know, it's kind of like, it's very fluid. And I guess that's kind of what I'm trying to say. And it's very hard to be stable because your power, your relationship to the government, your relationship to the state is all dependent on all these policies. So it can change any moment, and that makes it very difficult. So now we're going to delve into federal Indian law. Like I talk about, this is the case body of law that helps shape the Native American tribes' relationship to the federal and the state government. So overview, what I'm going to be talking about today are these 3 defining cases that shape their, like I said, shape that relationship. So we have a John versus McIntosh. So I kind of make this as a case from landowners to tenants. The Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. This is Native American tribes to the federal government. And then Worcester versus Georgia. This is the relationship between Native American tribes to the state government. And so I'm going to break these cases apart and kind of show you why these cases are so important and why they have an effect today. All right, so first is the Johnson v. versus McIntosh case, which was decided in 1823. That's what this little parentheses is. So like I said, this case took Native Americans from being landowners to just tenants. And so what does that mean? So let me give you a background about the case. So Johnson actually bought a tract of land from the Pinkenshaw Indians prior to the American Revolution. So after the Declaration of Independence, the state of Virginia created the county of Illinois where the land was located. Virginia then gave the land to the United States government, and about 35 years later, the United States government sold a portion of that land to William McIntosh, right? So basically you can see the change of hands of land. So Johnson bought it from Pinkenshaw, and then, so what happened was Johnson wanted that land back, right? That was already sold to William McIntosh. So then the question became, whose land does this belong to? So what was decided in this case was that the United States, so this is a posit that came from this case. So the United States holds absolute title to the land and not the Pinkenshaw Indians. So basically this case decided that Native Americans returned the right of occupancy, but did not have the right to sell land. So what does that mean? So the way I describe this is like, for example, if you have a car, right? If you have a car, imagine that title that you have, that when you buy your car, you're like, this is my car, I can do what I want with my car. Imagine that title is staying with your family or like your mother and they don't give it back to you. What can you do with that car, right? You can drive the car, you can tell people to get out of the car, you can do certain things, but one thing you can't do with that car is sell it because you don't have that title. Like that title is important in order to sell that land. So we call this like bundle of sticks in property law. So this case determined that Native Americans just can occupy the land, but we can't sell the land, which I'm going to talk about the implications of why that is very devastating for our communities. And so how did the court come up with this? Like, how did the court decide this kind of understanding? So it's based on doctrine of discovery. So what does that mean is that they stated that because they discovered the land, that they have power over the land. So because they were the conquest people, like they were the people who were first on the land. They were first discovered the land, therefore they have all the power of the land. And that was the rationale they used to decide to say that Native Americans only have the right to occupy, but doesn't have the right to sell. And so surprisingly, this case was foundational. It was a very foundational case, actually, for even American property law itself, because this case determined that state and federal government holds all land titles in the United States. So this is a very, very powerful case. And I put little racist themes in here because I kind of want to put language from the actual opinion itself. And there is racism in a lot of these opinions that I didn't know until I read the cases themselves. So like, for example, one of the quotes that I took from here was, fierce savages whose occupation was war, whose subsistence was drawn chiefly from the forest, to leave in possession of their country was to leave the country a wilderness. So this was based on that stereotype of Native Americans being savages and being wild and we need to be tamed. So that was part of the rationale of thinking of why we were not given full, complete rights to our land. Next, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. So this delineates the relationship between Native American tribes to the federal government. So basically the background for this case, which was decided in 1831, so Cherokee Chief John Ross tried to protect Cherokee lands, fight off that removal, like I talk about the Indian policy, the one that Andrew Jackson enacted, and to keep the laws of Georgia from being imposed on them. Cherokees argue that they are a sovereign nation and that Georgia law did not apply. So one of the things from this Supreme Court case that was decided that has huge implication is that they decided that Cherokees were not a foreign nation, but that we were considered a domestic dependent nation. So what does that mean? Meaning that we don't have complete rights as a nation, that we're sort of under the federal government and that we have limited rights. Like there's this dependency that we have on the government. And this was created by the court system. So how did they come up with this? What was that rationale? So a lot of it was paternalistic doctrine, actually, because the wordage they used in the opinion, for example, the relationship between the tribes and the United States government was that of a ward to a guardian. And they often use the word orphan throughout this opinion. And they were sort of pushing this definition that Indians were weak, that we were dependent and needed the assistance of a higher power. And that's basically where this rationale came for us to not be completely sovereign, but that we had to be underneath the United States government. So this is an important concept. So this is where that doctrine of federal a little feedback there. So this is where that doctrine of federal trust responsibility came from. So basically, tribes are under the protection of the United States. So this is an important concept, right? So first is we don't own the right to sell our land. And two, there's this trust responsibility that we're the ward of the United States government. So we have limited rights. And so where this came from, right? So the rationale, I was thinking there's more racist themes that came from this case. For example, one of the quotes I took from the opinion, I cannot but think there are strong reasons for doubting the applicability of the epithet state to a people so low in the grade of organized society as our Indian tribes most generally are. That's where that came from. And that these cases still have huge precedence today. They still have a lot of leeway in how we do things. And this is where it started from. Worcester versus Georgia. This is Native tribes to state government. So here, Marshall described the relationship of tribes to states. So in this situation, tribes possess the power to shield themselves from any intrusion by the states. And it is the federal government's responsibility that this sovereignty is preserved. So this was a more quote unquote positive opinion in that we retain rights from the states. So we're kind of on the same level as states in some regards. So this is a really good case in terms of like defending tribal rights and like taxation laws, civil rights laws. So this is the things that we talk about. So in summary, what I'm trying to describe in this part of the talk is that, for example, reservation land is held in trust by the federal government and tribal nations are unable to sell land. 2, the federal trust relationship doctrine. There's this federal responsibility over Indian affairs based on that case that I talked to you about. And a lot of these, like I said, doctrines, these cases were built under a racist and very paternalistic themes. And like I said, this doctrine of discovery has been used not only in these cases that I talk about, there's other cases that also have been used as precedents to decide other Native American rights as well. So how does this all, put together these huge concepts of like policy and law? So I'm gonna make a sort of understanding here. What I'm trying to say here is that reservation land held in trust, the federal trust responsibility, these two big sort of theories, these two big things are creating barriers to develop our economy, to develop our electricity and water infrastructure, and to develop any kind of adequate housing. There's a lot of barriers that these two concepts prevent us from doing. And so a lot of COVID-19 mitigation strategies. So, we already heard this so much. We even heard at the beginning of the CHEq presentation, you need to physically distance, you need to wash your hands, you need to wear your mask. In the beginning of this pandemic, it was very difficult to do these things. And part of that was because, understanding, all of us didn't know how to deal with this. And also just things started coming out, like in the news, about trying to figure out and explain why was there such a high per capita rate? So you heard in the news, like, 10% of the Navajos on a reservation live with electricity. Between 30 to 40% of Navajos do not have running water. Housing issues. So you saw a lot of clips and a lot of those data explaining why these COVID mitigation strategies weren't working. But what I'm trying to explain to you that there's a deeper level than just those statistics. So I'm going to try to bring this all together for you. right? So let's think about this. So barriers for land development, I think that's my theory, is these barriers for land development are caused by these two big concepts of our inability to sell land and the fact that we have this federal trust responsibility, which causes a lot of issues for our tribes, especially Navajo Nation. So one thing to think about is we have a lot of bureaucracy. So I always tell people that being Indigenous is very complex because of the bureaucracy that we have to deal with. Also, there's a lot of segmented land. We have different types of land types, which I'll go over, that makes it very difficult to do anything, like build businesses, to even take a water line to someone's home. It's very complicated, and I'll talk about that later. So this federal trust responsibility topic that I taught you guys, a majority of the Navajo Nation land is held in trust. So that means, right, that we can't sell that land. So also we have, because of this federal trust responsibility, we have to have a relationship with the government, and that's usually through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They're considered the manager of the Indian property. They have the last say on what we can and cannot do. So like I said, BIA is the first agency that must be involved in any activity on those lands requiring authorization. The federal government can invoke its trust obligations. So at any point during any leasing or any kind of contracting, the BIA has to have approved agreements. And so this causes a lot of difficulty because of these different layers. And I'll talk about that later about what this really means in a practical sense. So like I talked about, the Navajo Nation land status is super complex. So these are all the different kinds of lands that you can find on our reservation, especially our reservation in Navajo land. Like I said, there's a tribal trust land, there's BIA Indian allotment lands, there's the Bureau of Land Management, there's tribal fee land, which is basically land that was bought out of trust. So they gave up the trust responsibility, like gave up the trust from the government to buy it back. So some of the land are like that for tribal fee lands. Private land, there's also public land, there's state land. So why is this complex? Oh, and I want to talk about allotment land really quick. So about 8% of our land, especially New Mexico, has some allotment land. And so what does that mean? So like I had talked about the Allotment Act that was passed. As you can see here, for example, let's take take this piece of land right here, right? So imagine this land here is your land. It's given to you, right? One original allottee, one owner. Then that land is divided into, for three people. Let's say you have 3 children. So then that's divided into threes. Then let's say they have children, right? So now you have 9 owners of that land. Then 4th generation, let's say they have children. So now this belongs to 27 owners. Then they have children and so forth, 81 owners. And by 6th generation, this little land here has 243 owners. So let's say, for example, you wanted to do a water pipeline, or you want to do something like create electricity through here. You wanted to do land business development. You would have to get the approval of 243 owners to get that done. So this causes a lot of issues for our tribes, because getting that consensus or getting that consent to build on land like that is very difficult. And like I said, New Mexico side has a lot of this allotment land, more than the Arizona side. See, it's even complex too, because Navajo Nation, like I said, spans 4 different states. So they all have different state laws. It gets complex fast. So different parts of Navajo Nation, like I mentioned before, has different types of land statuses. New Mexico has mainly tribal trust lands, tribal fee, BIA Indian allotments, private and BLM lands. And on Arizona, Utah side, there are a few private, but some BIA Indian allotments in comparison, a fewer BIA Indian allotments in comparison to the New Mexico portion. So as you can see here, there's even different types of land based on which part of the Navajo Nation you're in. So that could get very complex fast. Trying to get permits, trying to get approval, trying to get consent from all these things is very difficult. So that's just one layer, right? Then next, so how this has impacts, right? So how does this have impacts on our economic development? So tribal lands and reservations are held in trust, right? That's a concept we just learned, by the federal government. Tribal members do not own their lands. So this makes it very difficult to get loans without collateral, right? You need collateral in order to get loans often. So this makes it very difficult for people to get those loans to build businesses. Also, you can't mortgage your land. I know some people like mortgage their home in order to like invest in their business. Those things we can't do because we don't have the title to our land. So that makes it very difficult to access that because it's held in trust. And then number two, because of that trust relationship, the federal trust relationship that I talked about, you have to go through the federal government to do anything. So in order to lease, in order to build, you have to go through many government hurdles just to get through that. And I'll talk about that more. And this process is incredibly expensive. And so I think this is all these two big concepts are really holding back our tribe. And like I said, our tribal land is as big as West Virginia, but imagine having that much wealth that you can't access. Therefore, Navajo Nation has few businesses, lack of revenue, therefore little funding to invest in infrastructure. So how does this impact water and electricity development? So for example, like I said before, getting those permits is very difficult because the Navajo Nation land status is just all different. So getting that is complex and time consuming. And then we also have a large funding issue, like we have difficulty getting funding to build that infrastructure. So one of the council delegate meetings that I had listened in on said that we need about $700 million in order to do some of this work. And so it's very difficult because we don't, like I said, that lack of economic development based on the fact that we don't have a lot of businesses, based on the fact that a lot of that has to do with our inability to access the land itself. And then water supply and connection to communities. So it's very difficult, like I said, to get waters to communities. So the Eastern Navajo Nation Agency, in order to get the supply of water, has to go through congressional acts sometimes because they can't settle it. So it takes so much time for them to even do this. For example, the Western Navajo Nation Agency, their pipeline project is still in process because they're trying to negotiate right-of-ways through that. And then another example is at Tuahajale, which is a community near Albuquerque. Private landowners are actually preventing a water line to go from Albuquerque to the satellite community. So it's because one person says no, that ability to develop water in that area is very difficult. So there's a lot of things that a lot of people have to do in order to get like water and electricity. And of course, there's wastewater and sewer infrastructure that also needs to be placed in context of this as well. And so impacts on housing, this is a huge one. We have a lot of multi-generational housing where I'm from, a lot of crowding. So about 9 to 10 individuals can live in one home sometimes. And of course, like we know COVID, you have increased exposure due to crowding. And so I think part of this also has to do with this tribal trust, right? Reservation land, you can't get a mortgage on the land. Federal trust responsibility, there's a significant amount of red tape involved just to get a home. This relationship between the tribe and federal government triggers the EPA regulation. So what I mean by that is any major federal action by the EPA triggers the, like you have to go through different layers in order to get a project approval. So because we're considered federal funding, there's a lot of red tape that's involved in this, that it costs millions of dollars sometimes to even build a business. Because of this, we have these complicated home site leasing. So we can't even home site buy, it's called leasing, because that's all we can do, right? Because of that big concept of the fact that we don't hold title to our land. So in order to lease the land is even complicated, and to construct the land is more complicated. So in order to establish a lease, you have to first get the local lands office approval is needed. So the local chapter house, which is one of the local governments. Then on top of that, the tribal land office must give its approval. Then on top of that, the BIA, like I said, the federal government also has to give their final approval. So often these leases, just to get a lease takes years, like 10 years, 15 years. Some people like don't even get the lease at all. And it takes a lot of time in order to just get the lease in order to even starting to build. So that's really complicated. To construct is even, like I said, the land has to be surveyed by the land office. Impact studies have to be completed. Like I said, this is part of that EPA federal government regulation. So you have to get a biological clearance request, you have to get an archaeology inventory report, you have to get a cultural resources compliance form, you have to get an environmental review letter from the Navajo Nation EPA and a land survey in order to construct something. So you have to go through all of this to just lease the land, to get the land. Then you have to go through all of this to construct a home. And then at the end of the day, that land that you live on, like you can't take a mortgage on it after all of that work. So what I was trying to teach you today, like I said, is just, it's very complicated. Like the housing situation, the water, access to water, is very complicated. And like I said, the things that we go through as Native people isn't because we're just poor or because, you know, because often you see those statistics. There's a lot of layers going on that prevent us from enacting our full sovereignty. And I think that's what I wanted to talk to you about today, and hopefully enlighten you that there's more going on under that superficial layer that you see on the news. So it's, in conclusion, reservation land held in trust and the establishment of the federal trust responsibility has created these barriers for the Navajo Nation to protect its citizens. It's created these barriers for us to do economic development. It's created barriers in our ability to improve our water infrastructure. It's created barriers in our ability to house our families. Any questions?